What would you do if you discovered that the person who promised to love and be faithful to you was repeatedly betraying you without the slightest remorse? And what if, on top of that, everyone knew about it and mocked you for staying with them? Sounds absurd, right? But that's exactly what happened to Hosea, a man who was publicly humiliated as his wife constantly gave herself to other men. And the worst part, he didn't just forgive her, he paid a high price to have her back. But why? What kind of love is this? The Bible is full of shocking stories, but few are as dramatic as this one. When people think of unfaithful women, names like Jezebel, Herodias, and Potiphar's wife often come to mind. But none of them compare to Gomer. She didn't just cheat, she made infidelity her way of life. She chose the path of betrayal without looking back, showing no regard for the husband who loved her. And even when everything fell apart, something truly surprising happened. This story isn't just about a broken marriage. It reveals deep spiritual truths that many people overlook. Gomer isn't just an unfaithful woman, she's a symbol. Her life mirrors how many people treat God, exchanging true love for fleeting illusions. Just as Hosea suffered from his wife's betrayal, God suffers when those he loves turn away from him, seeking security and pleasure in things that ultimately bring destruction. But here's the most astonishing part. Even in the face of such unfaithfulness, God still offers redemption. If you think this story ends in tragedy, get ready for something that defies all human logic. What happens with Gomer and Hosea goes far beyond what anyone would expect. And what does all of this have to do with you? Believe me, this story carries a message that can transform your life, but only if you're willing to see what's really happening here. Throughout history, unfaithfulness has been a recurring theme among humankind, and the Bible is no exception. Among the women who defied divine principles, some became symbols of treachery and corruption. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce a faithful servant. Herodias manipulated events to satisfy her own ambition, and Jezebel spread idolatry and destruction. But none of them embodied unfaithfulness as intensely as Gomer. Her story is not just about a marriage in ruins. It's about a cycle of betrayal that unveils profound truths about the relationship between God and his people. What makes Gomer the most unfaithful woman in the Bible is not just the fact that she cheated on her husband, but the way she deliberately lived in unfaithfulness without any apparent regret. She wasn't seduced in a moment of weakness. She consciously abandoned Hosea over and over again, seeking out other lovers as if her commitment meant nothing. While many see infidelity only in the context of marriage, Gomer's story extends far beyond that. Her life became a mirror of Israel's spiritual unfaithfulness as they repeatedly turned away from God in pursuit of fleeting pleasures and false gods. The historical context of this story is crucial to understanding its implications. Israel was in a period of severe moral and spiritual decline. Idolatry wasn't just common, it was encouraged. The people who had once made a covenant with God had replaced true faith with pagan rituals. Temples dedicated to false gods were everywhere, and within them, shocking practices took place. Cultic prostitution, human sacrifices, and widespread corruption. What was once considered evil was now seen as normal. It's easy to judge Gomer, but the truth is, her story isn't far from the reality many people live today. How many commit to something true only to be distracted by the temptations of life? It's like someone who decides to change their life, to follow a path of discipline and purpose, only to fall back into the same destructive habits. Gomer's actions weren't just isolated mistakes, they were part of a pattern that many still follow today. But here's the most striking part. Despite her unfaithfulness, Gomer was not abandoned. God commanded Hosea to stay with her, even as he was humiliated and rejected. And this wasn't just a test of marital endurance, it was a powerful message about divine love. God, like Hosea, remains faithful even when his people choose to go astray. But how far does that love go? Is there a limit to divine patience? Gomer's story is about to take a shocking turn. Gomer didn't just betray Hosea, she made betrayal a way of life. She wasn't swept away by a fleeting passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. Her unfaithfulness was a continuous choice. Imagine a man who dedicates himself fully to someone, does everything to care for, protect, and provide security for them, only to receive nothing but rejection and abandonment in return. That was Hosea's reality. While he remained faithful, Gomer ran after other lovers, giving herself away without hesitation. To her, commitment meant nothing, and the stability Hosea offered seemed worthless compared to the empty promises she received. Gomer's betrayal wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Her life reflected Israel's behavior toward God. People who had been chosen, loved, and sustained constantly sought idols, alliances with pagan nations, and practices that distorted true faith. Just as Gomer didn't see the value in her husband, Israel didn't recognize the faithfulness of God. Every mistake they made was another step further away from him. Hosea witnessed all of this happening, and the pain he felt was overwhelming. He wasn't just dealing with his wife's abandonment, he was being publicly humiliated. Imagine a respected man, a prophet of God, being ridiculed for staying married to a woman who clearly didn't value him. Hosea's suffering teaches a powerful lesson. Sometimes, following God's will means enduring situations that seem absurd to others. Doing what's right doesn't always make sense to the world. But here's the hard truth. Love doesn't eliminate consequences. God loves, but he also disciplines. Hosea remained married, but that didn't prevent Gomer from facing the results of her choices. She believed her freedom would bring her happiness, but her decisions were leading her toward destruction. And that's exactly what happens to people who mistake freedom for the absence of commitment, pleasure for true joy. The real question is, would Gomer realize her mistake before it was too late? Or would she have to hit rock bottom to finally understand what truly mattered? Her choices were about to lead her down a path of no return. To fully grasp Gomer and Hosea's story, we need to understand the world they lived in. Israel was in a state of deep moral and spiritual decay. Idolatry wasn't just tolerated, it was widespread and encouraged. The people, once committed to a covenant with God, had replaced true faith with pagan rituals. Temples to false gods stood everywhere, hosting disturbing practices, cultic prostitution, human sacrifices, and rampant corruption. What was once unthinkable was now the norm. Right and wrong had been completely inverted. Politically, Israel had also lost its way. The nation made alliances with foreign powers, trading its spiritual identity for military and economic security. Kings formed agreements with pagan nations, allowing their customs to seep into Israelite culture. And these weren't just symbolic traditions. These influences brought perverse rituals that desecrated God's covenant. The people thought they were securing their future, but in reality, they were destroying themselves from the inside out. Society itself was a reflection of this spiritual infidelity. Marriage, a sacred covenant, was no longer honored. Morality had become optional. Men and women abandoned their vows without a second thought, believing they were simply living life. Gomer wasn't just an individual case, she was the product of a generation that had lost all sense of commitment and faithfulness. If we draw a parallel to today, the similarities are startling. We live in an age where truth is dictated by convenience. What was once unshakable is now dismissed as outdated. Values are disposable, and people chase fleeting pleasure, ignoring long-term consequences. How many marriages fall apart because someone decides they just don't feel the same anymore? How many promises are broken because commitment has become an inconvenience? Gomer's unfaithfulness is not just an ancient story. It's happening all around us. Hosea on the other, and represented something few could understand: unwavering faithfulness. He didn't just love Gomer, he remained by her side even when the world mocked him. To many, this looked like foolishness, but in reality, it was a reflection of divine love. Because just as Gomer's betrayal symbolized Israel's infidelity, Hosea's devotion symbolized God's enduring love for his people. But Gomer had no idea what was coming next. Her choices were about to lead her to a place she never imagined. How long would her lovers keep her around? How long would her so-called freedom bring her joy? The illusion she was living was about to collapse. Gomer's story goes beyond a failed marriage. It mirrors Israel's relationship with God. The people of Israel, once loved and protected by God, repeatedly turned their backs on him, choosing idols and false gods over true faith. Just as Gomer ran after lovers, Israel pursued alliances with pagan nations, embracing corruption and idolatry. This wasn't an isolated event, it was a cycle of betrayal. God would rescue them, they would repent, but before long they would return to their old ways, sinking deeper each time. This spiritual unfaithfulness wasn't just about religion, it was cultural, political, and moral. Israel abandoned divine principles for convenience. Leaders became corrupt, priests stopped teaching the truth, and sin became normalized. What was once seen as wrong was now celebrated. And that's exactly how spiritual infidelity works. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts with small compromises, little by little, until one day you realize you're completely disconnected from God. And this pattern continues today. How often do people commit to God only to slowly drift away? First, they skip prayer. Then, they stop reading the Bible. Eventually, faith becomes secondary. Before they even realize it, their priorities have completely shifted. Israel made the same mistake. What started as an outside influence soon became the heart of their culture. Their spiritual decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow, deliberate process. But what's incredible is that God never abandoned them. Just as Hosea remained committed to Gomer despite her betrayal, God continued calling his people back. He sent prophets to warn them, to urge them to return, but instead of listening, they ignored him. It's always easier to stay in a comfortable deception than to face the truth. And that's the danger. People cling to their sin until the pain becomes unbearable. Israel's unfaithfulness had consequences. God is loving, but he is also just. He couldn't ignore their betrayal forever. Just like in marriage, there is a limit to how much betrayal can be forgiven before judgment comes. The people who insisted on turning away from God would eventually face the consequences of their choices. But before judgment, God always offers a way back. The problem? Not everyone is willing to take it. And here's where things take a dramatic turn. Just as Israel failed to see the danger of their spiritual unfaithfulness, Gomer had no idea how far she was about to fall. She thought her lovers would always take care of her, but soon they would abandon her. And when there was nothing left, when every door closed, who would still be there to save her? Gomer believed that her beauty and charm would always guarantee her a place of comfort. Her lovers showered her with gifts, offered her luxury and pleasure, and she convinced herself that this life would last forever. But the truth is, the world never holds on to anyone out of love. It uses them until they are no longer useful. And that's exactly what happened to her. One by one, the same men who once pursued her vanished. The ones who seemed so generous suddenly lost interest. Gomer, who once lived in abundance, now faced something she never expected: total abandonment. Her fall wasn't immediate. First, the gifts became less frequent. Then, the favors started drying up. And then came the final humiliation. She was left with nothing. The so-called freedom that had seemed so precious was now a crushing burden. She thought she could always find another way out, another man to provide for her. But now, there were no more options. The world, which once looked like an endless field of opportunities, had turned into a prison with no escape. And then came the ultimate downfall. Gomer was sold into slavery. The woman who once made her own choices now had no control over her fate. This is what happens when people ignore God's warnings. Eventually the consequences come, and by then there's no way to undo them. Israel was heading down the same path. The nation that was once prosperous and protected was now marching toward ruin. Their love for idols, just like Gomer's love for her lovers, was leading them into destruction. Her downfall was a reflection of what was about to happen to the entire nation. How many people live like this today? At first, they believe they can handle everything their own way. They push aside God's principles, chasing after whatever seems fulfilling at the moment, but slowly things start to unravel. Broken relationships, bad decisions, missed opportunities. One by one, the doors start to close. The world deceives with momentary pleasures, but never offers true security. And then, one day, they wake up and realize they're trapped in a life they never intended to have. But here's what Gomer never saw coming. Her story wasn't over. Just as Israel wasn't completely forsaken, her fate wasn't sealed yet. Hosea had every reason to walk away. No one would have blamed him for leaving her to suffer the consequences of her choices, but he didn't. He was about to do something that defied all logic, something that no one expected. Gomer, the woman who once lived surrounded by lovers and pleasures, now found herself at the lowest point of humiliation. She was being sold as a slave. Imagine the scene. She, who once dressed in luxury, now stood in rags, filthy and worthless in the eyes of those who once adored her. The slave market was no place of compassion. It was brutal. People were bought and sold like objects, stripped of dignity and hope. Gomer, who had once thought she was in control, now had no control over her own fate. And then, in the midst of that crowd, someone unexpected appeared. Hosea, the very man she had betrayed time and time again, the one who had every reason to walk away, to never look back. And yet, there he was, standing in front of her, ready to pay the price for her freedom. But why? What kind of man would do such a thing? To anyone watching, Hosea looked like a fool. Who would willingly buy back someone who had humiliated them? But Hosea wasn't acting out of emotion. He was fulfilling a divine mission. His love wasn't based on what Gomer deserved, but on what God had commanded him to do. What happened next defied all human logic. As the auctioneer called out the bids for the disgraced woman, Hosea raised his voice and made an offer. He didn't negotiate. He didn't try to get a better deal. He paid the full price to redeem her. The crowd must have been in shock. How could a man pay so much for someone who had betrayed him so deeply? But that's where the greatest lesson of this story is found. Hosea wasn't just buying back his wife. He was demonstrating the love of God in a way that people could see with their own eyes. If we step back and look at this from a spiritual perspective, we see something even deeper. What Hosea did for Gomer is exactly what Jesus Christ did for humanity. All of us were slaves to sin, sold into spiritual bondage with no way to free ourselves. And just like Hosea, Jesus stepped forward and paid the price. But unlike Hosea, Jesus didn't buy us back with silver or gold. He paid with his own blood. He didn't redeem us because we deserved it, but because he chose to love us even in our betrayal. Now imagine what must have gone through Gomer's mind in that moment. Did she expect to be rescued? Did she finally understand the depth of Hosea's love? So many times, people only recognize the value of what they have after it's gone. How many people must hit rock bottom before realizing what God has already done for them? The problem was never a lack of love. It was a failure to see it. And now, standing in front of Hosea, Gomer had a second chance. But this wasn't the end of the story. Being rescued was just the beginning. What would happen next? Gomer had been bought back, but would she finally change? And what about Hosea? Could he truly rebuild a relationship with someone who had hurt him so deeply? The final lesson of this story holds a truth that can change lives. Hosea and Gomer's story isn't just about a ruined marriage restored. It's a prophetic picture of the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus Christ. Just as Gomer was sold into slavery and bought back by Hosea, humanity was lost in sin, enslaved with no way out. And just as Hosea paid a high price to redeem someone who had betrayed him, Christ paid the ultimate price for those who rejected him. But his payment was far greater, his own life poured out on the cross. What makes this comparison so powerful is that in both cases, redemption was undeserved. Gomer had done nothing to justify Hosea's forgiveness. She had given him every reason to walk away. The same is true for us. How many times have we turned away from God, ignored him, and chosen other things over him? And yet, Jesus still came. He didn't wait for us to be worthy. He loved us first. When we look at the cross, we see that Christ's sacrifice had a purpose: to restore a broken relationship. Sin separated us from God, just as Gomer's unfaithfulness separated her from Hosea. But God didn't abandon us. He stepped in, paid the price, and made a way back. This is what makes the gospel so powerful. It's not a message about deserving grace. It's about receiving it. Another incredible detail is that, just like Gomer wasn't rescued to continue living the same way, those who are saved by Christ are not meant to stay in their old ways. God's forgiveness isn't a free pass to keep sinning. It's an opportunity to start over. Hosea brought Gomer back, not just to save her from slavery, but to restore what was lost. God does the same with us. He redeems us not just to spare us from judgment, but to transform us. But here's the hard truth. Many people want salvation, but they don't want change. They want God's mercy, but they don't want to leave the lifestyle that led them astray. In the first place, Gomer had to learn this lesson. She was given another chance, but what she did with it was up to her. And that's the same question for all of us. What will we do with Christ's sacrifice? Will we cherish it, or will we continue betraying the one who loved us first? Hosea and Gomer's story doesn't end with the rescue. It ends with a choice. Gomer now had a new beginning, but would she truly embrace it? And what about us? How will we respond to the love that God has already shown us? Gomer's story isn't just about one woman's unfaithfulness. It's a reflection of human nature. How many people walk away from God, chasing after things that in the end only destroy them? Just as Gomer ran into the arms of men who didn't truly care for her, so many people trade eternal things for temporary pleasure. Money, status, worldly success. It all seems fulfilling at first, but eventually it leaves people empty. The world makes big promises but abandons people when they need help the most. The question is, how many times has God already rescued you? How many times has He saved you from bad choices, closed doors that would have led to disaster, or given you second chances you didn't deserve? Just like Hosea never gave up on Gomer, God never gives up on those He loves. But here's the thing, His patience isn't an invitation to continue in sin. At some point, the choices must change. The price has already been paid. But are we truly honoring that sacrifice? This story forces us to ask, are we living like Gomer? It's easy to judge her actions, but are we guilty of the same spiritual betrayal? When we put our trust in things other than God, we are doing exactly what Israel did. When we seek solutions elsewhere before turning to Him, we are repeating the same mistakes. Spiritual unfaithfulness isn't just worshiping false gods. It's trusting anything more than God Himself. But here's the greatest truth. God always offers a way back. Just as Gomer was given a second chance, we all have the opportunity to start over. It doesn't matter how far someone has gone. how many times they've failed, God's love is still available, but grace requires a response. What will we do with it? So now the decision is yours. Will you continue chasing things that will never satisfy you, or will you return to the one who has always been waiting for you? The price has already been paid. The only question is what you will do with it. If this message spoke to you, don't leave without sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep learning deep truths from the Bible, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's much more to come. And now, the question you can't ignore. Are you repeating Gomer's mistakes? Maybe this story feels distant, but if we look closely, we'll see that many people live exactly like she did, turning away from God, chasing after things that only bring pain. Just like Gomer ran into the arms of lovers who didn't care about her, many people today trade what is eternal for what is temporary. The problem: the world promises much, but abandons you when you need it the most. So let me ask you, how many times has God already rescued you? How many times has He protected you from bad choices, led you away from danger, and given you second chances? Just like Hosea never gave up on Gomer, God has never given up on you. But listen carefully, God's patience is not a free pass to stay in sin. At some point, choices must change. The price for your rescue has already been paid. But are you truly honoring that sacrifice? This story forces you to ask, are you living like Gomer? It's easy to judge her, but are you guilty of the same spiritual betrayal? When you place your trust in things other than God, you are doing exactly what Israel did. When you seek comfort and solutions elsewhere before turning to Him, you are making the same mistake. Spiritual unfaithfulness isn't just about worshiping false gods. It's about trusting in anything more than God Himself. But here's the greatest truth: God always offers a way back. Just as Gomer was given another chance, so are you. It doesn't matter how far you've gone or how many times you've failed, God's love is still available. But grace requires a response. What will you do with it? So now the decision is yours. Will you continue chasing things that will never satisfy you? Or will you return to the one who has always been waiting for you? The price has already been paid. The only question left is what you will do with it. If this message spoke to you, don't leave without sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep learning deep truths from the Bible, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's much more to come.